Now there is another function that is more generic. So this is very specific. So when we say by tag name, then we have to send by tag name, right? So whatever is sent here is assumed to be a tag name. There is a function that is more generic. No. There's a function that is more generic that's called query selector. So that query selector can take ID, can take a class name, or can take a tag name. Now, how can we distinguish, like how can it internally distinguish between the ID and the class name and the tag name is whether there is a prefix or not. So if we prefix the name by hash, it means that we want to search by ID. Okay? If we prefix the name by a dot, then it means we want to search by class name. If we don't prefix the name, the string at all, then it means we're searching by tag name. Okay, so that's similar to the selector that we learned about when we learned about style sheets, right? So the dot refers to the class name, the hash refers to the ID, and no prefix is just the tag name. Yes.
What is returning the address?
The element itself, the object, so it returns one element, one object element. Okay. One node element. When you mean the address, you mean the reference to the object? Yeah, reference to the object. Okay. Is that what you meant?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, so here, we know when we search by the ID, only one element that's gonna return, right? But here and here, we can have multiple elements, right? But the query selector only returned one element, that is the first element in the list. If we want to access them all, then there's another function or another method called query selector all. Okay, so that will return the entire list of nodes. Okay, so here now we can combine them just like the CSS. We can combine them too. So this part doesn't have prefix, so this part is the tag name, and then there is a dot. So what comes after that is the class name, right? Right. So we can have there's more flexibility here. So if we use the get element by, so we can have multiple. Still, we can get the same effect, but with multiple calls. Okay, but here we can just have one call and specify a tag name and a class. Okay, so what returns here is the what we call the node list. So there is the object that's called node, and then there is the object that's called node list. So it is similar to the array. Okay, the node list similar to array, and we can access the elements using the square brackets, just like we do with an array. Okay, so let's say here. Well, actually, the presentation of the book called this node list. So sometimes it's a node list, sometimes it's HTML collection. We will look at it in the browser to see exactly. They are not very different. It's just the name of the collection. Okay, so when we get elements by class name here, we have a list. We access, if we want the first element, we access it with the index 0. All right. Now, sometimes when we look for something, it may not exist. So it's good to safeguard your code by checking the length of the list. So it is very similar to the array in terms that it has a length property, and it is accessible through what we call the indexer, the square brackets with the index. All right, now let's see that. I'm just gonna have this code. So I have VS Code already open. So I'm just gonna copy this part. And I wanna highlight something when we copied some code from a rich document like PowerPoint or Word, we have to be careful with what we copy, okay? So I'm just gonna create a new file. I call it index.html. Okay, now the parent of the entire document has to be what? The HTML tag, right? And then inside the HTML there could be head and could be body. So I'm just gonna go with the body. All right, and then inside that body we have the list that we have here. Okay, now we notice this code. So this is not the plain text code. This is not the correct code. The browser is not gonna recognize it. So we have to replace it by the plain text code. So I'm just gonna replace with that. Now notice also this is not the same character as this one. So the opening is not the same character as the closing too. So I'm just gonna replace them all. And also we'll replace the closing character as well. All right, so now we are good. Now let's run this in the Chrome. I'm not sure if Chrome is my default. Yeah, it is. All right. So there you go. Here's the list that we have. All right, now we can look at the browser. I mean the document, the developers tools. Okay, we can look at the elements here if we want to see them all. We can also see them when we open the file through sources, right? So this is the HTML. Now we want to access them through JavaScript. I'm gonna use this console as a sandbox to try to access the elements here. So let's say I want to access this element. How do I do that? There is one way using, so document is the object that we start with. Let's start by get element by ID. And then I'll just give it the ID. I think the second one here, if we look at the elements, the ID of that one is 2, the word 2. So I'm just gonna use that in the query. Now it returns that object. Okay. Now I can say let second element equal, and then I would be able to access it through that reference. Okay. Now what if I wanna get all the li elements? So I can say get document get element by. So if we're not gonna use the ID, we have to add the S. And you can see here, there are multiple ways. So there's a class name by name. So that would be the an attribute name, just like the ID, okay? But the attribute name doesn't have to be unique. So you also have to have the S here. So let's say we want to access them by class name, and there's a class hot there. So let's see. Now you see, this will return HTML collection, okay? And if we open it, you will see that we can access them by index, just like any, like the array. So let's say I want the first one. Okay, I want the second one. Okay, and so on. All right, now what if we want to try the query selector? Okay, so let me just clear that. How do I access, so let's say, if I just use just simple query selector, it will return the first element. Okay, so let's say I'm gonna say document dot query selector, and I will send the class name. Okay, so it will return a reference to that first element, but there are multiple of them, right? So if I want them all, I can say query selector all. Okay, now it's not the HTML collection, it's node list, which is not a lot of, it's not very different. It's different. I mean, in terms of accessing the elements, it's not very different, but we could notice that there were most other properties as well there. Okay, so let's say I want to access that second one here, so that would be of index 1. All right, so that would be, now I can receive it in a variable. So okay, now what if I want to know the attributes, like the ID or class name? How do I access the attributes? If I say second li dot get attribute and give it the name of the attribute, let's say I want to have I want to know the ID of that element, or I want to know the class of that element. Okay, using the get attribute and give it the name of the attribute. Now here's the thing. There are objects, there are properties that refer to these attributes, but they don't always have the same name. So let's say the actual attribute name, if we go to the element itself, the attribute name here is called class, right? And when we access it using the get attribute method, we use the same name that was in the HTML element, right? Now, if we just look at the object itself and say dot, if I try to access that class, there is nothing called class, just class. Okay, so there are direct properties that refer to the attributes, but the property of the JavaScript object is not exactly the same thing. Okay, so when you have a property in the JavaScript object, you can have a property in the JavaScript object that refers to the attribute of the HTML element. It refers to it, but they are not exactly the same thing. They are not one thing. All right, so I'm using class because it's very obvious, because they have different names. Okay, so when we say class name, that is the property that refers to the class attribute. So the JavaScript property class name refers to the HTML attribute class. All right. Now I can change it. I can, just like I read it, I can change it as well. I can say new class, for example. Now, if I try to say get attribute class, you will see the new name. So it refers to it. It doesn't mean that they are exactly the same. Okay. Now, sometimes the property would have the same name, like the ID, but we know, even like just because they have the same name doesn't mean that they are the same thing. Okay, I'm trying to emphasize this point because it will make a difference when we talk about events. Okay. All right, so any questions regarding the general query selectors and accessing the attributes? Okay, so let's continue then.
Okay.